A report came out a few days ago that G2 has made a verbal agreement with a number of the players, I think the wording is several, of the former Guard players. And I want to go through it because we've been covering the Guard situation quite a bit on this channel, and it's a nice conclusion, it seems, to the entire story, while the rest of the world explodes in madness and roster moves. So I'll definitely cover those at some point too, but I promised you that we would be talking about some roster move stuff, and this is where I want to kind of kick it off. First of all, thank you very much for supporting this channel as well. It was a bit of a gamble for me to make a brand new channel just to discuss Valorant stuff, and if you aren't subscribed, please consider doing so. At the moment, I think the channel only has about 7k subscribers, and it's getting like 15k viewers, so clearly at least half of you are not subscribed yet, probably thinking that you're still watching this on my old channel. Let's get into it though. Let's pull up this article because here it is from Alejandro Gomez, who's been doing a bunch of reporting over this offseason, has been doing a fantastic job of it too. And the headline is, sources, G2 has reached a verbal agreement with several of the Guards players. And it's been modified 8th of September, which is when the players were tweeting these, you know, contract signing stuff. You saw Valen, and you saw Trent, and you saw Jonah P, and you saw Net, and then you saw Tex post tears in the rain, and then saying his time with the Guard is coming to an end. But we'll get to that in shortly. But I want to kind of go through this this report a little bit and add some extra context for those of you who might not have been following the entire story, right? So, according to sources with knowledge of the situation, Blix understands that German organization G2 Esports has reached a verbal agreement to sign multiple members of the Guard's former lineup. According to these sources, G2 are targeting at least 3 players in order to lay claim to the Guard's VCT Ascension spot. So the report here seeming to indicate that G2 required at least 3 of the players in order to keep the Ascension spot. And let's start with talking about the numbers, because Disguised Toast went on stream too and speculated that the numbers that he's heard floating around are super high, saying that G2 might be paying... Disguised Toast on stream said G2 might be paying $2 million per year for the slot, basically. Which, if you don't want to be bothered doing the maths, that's about a 33k salary per month. Which is large, but is not, and that's assuming that they would be spending all the money on salaries rather than some other things as well, and that's assuming that it would just be split between the 5 players and not necessarily like Josh RT getting in on it too. So, you know, I'm just doing some very rough napkin math here. I'm not saying the salaries are necessarily above 30k, but still, if they're in that kind of ballpark whatsoever, they are going to end up being really quite highly paid players, especially considering that a lot of the people that were on 30, 40k salaries are getting that cut down this year because a lot of orgs are trying to tighten the purse strings. There's generally just a widespread belief that these players are going to be among the highest paid in VCT. Maybe not the highest paid players, but certainly among them. Just because Americas was already paying inflated salaries, and while everybody else is cutting down, these players hold the keys to the castle. They are really incentivized to have bags thrown at them. And so why G2 specifically? Why would G2 be specifically incentivized for the bag to be thrown at them? Well, I think the first thing that you would have to keep in mind is that G2 tried to get into partnerships before, right? We saw this kind of situation occur previously where G2 were essentially finalized. Like Cloud9 only got their spot in VCT partnerships because G2 had the Tate Gate incident where Carlos was partying with Andrew Tate and then doubled down on it and was like, I party with whoever the fuck I want, etc., leading to him being removed from the G2 organization and Riot declining to add them to the partnership system. Partly because of the public outrage over somebody like Tate being involved in such like close proximity to esports, but also I would say partly from a business sense perspective of him just tanking the brand at that point without too much regard for what was going on, by just sticking to his personal principles of you don't get to tell me what to do because you don't like the people I hang out with, which that's certainly a principle to have. I don't think it's a particularly valuable one, but it's a principle. I did a video about this as well that I'll post in the description when it actually happened. But that kind of sets the context for G2 have been wanting to get into VCT partnerships for a while, and they've just been looking for their way in. And this, they didn't have a team that ended up going on and winning Ascension. They did participate with, you know, that kind of former Sentinels core with Shaz leading that. And now they've got an opportunity to get in by discarding that team and going and picking up another. But also from a monetary perspective, or a kind of a finances perspective, why are G2 interested so much in getting a VCT Americas slot? Because if you think back as well, when they were trying to get in the first round of partnerships, it was VCT Americas. It wasn't VCT EMEA. And as this report quite fairly notes, they are a German organization with, previously a Spaniard at the helm and a history of being an EMEA org. So why are they trying to get into VCT Americas? And part of this, obviously, they are financially incentivized to throw the bag at the guard players just to get into partnerships anyway, right? Because partnerships, Valorant is in a growth cycle right now. It looks like a really hot prospect of a game to get into. The viewership's good, the engagement's good, and specifically Riot's model is quite good for the orgs as well. They get a stipend as long as they do certain things in terms of marketing the teams and producing content and stuff. So they get money from Riot just for having the spot. And they also have access to digital goods. Now, we did hear from Leo that team skins are not going to be available for the teams that ascended. So teams like G2 who just got in, because presumably, if I'm reading between the lines here, it's because they don't have time to be able to make something as elaborate as team skins, because we've heard that those take a long time to produce. However, I would imagine that there's something else there involved as well, maybe some gun buddies, maybe some other kind of skin-like items, banners, whatever, that are going to contribute to digital goods sales, even for the Ascension teams. So there's good reasons just for them to be involved in partnerships anyway. But North America is where the money is. And you might not understand this if you haven't been involved in like selling advertising. And I can tell you just from being involved in Platchat, but also from talking to a bunch of people who are involved in way larger corporations as well, and behind people at the leagues, that North American marketing budgets are the ones you want to tap into. North American companies have marketing budgets assigned for the whole of the USA, which is enormous. It's the third most populous country in the world. And the company, let's say Coca-Cola or whatever, it has a budget for the USA, for the entire thing. It doesn't usually have a budget for each individual state or for like East Coast, West Coast or anything like that. It just tends to have one big fuck-off budget. And that's very, very different to EMEA, for example, which would be the, you might assume, natural resting place of G2 if they were to get into partnerships. The EMEA, or rather in Europe in general, you have a marketing budget for one country. You have a UK marketing budget. You have a German marketing budget. You have a French marketing budget, because the marketing often needs to be in different languages. You need to tap into different cultural things. You need to approach it in a different way. You need to be working with different companies in order to distribute it in certain ways, right? So it makes sense for companies to segment that budget up into all of the little pieces. And then it's very difficult for you to approach Coca-Cola, Europe, because it doesn't necessarily exist. Again, I'm using this as an example. Maybe Coca-Cola are a rare company where they do, but for most companies, they don't have a European division so much as a bunch of smaller based on the countries in which they operate. And for you to try and get them to combine those budgets together and give you a nice, big, fat, juicy sponsorship deal is really tough, because there's a lot of red tape involved in that, and they don't enjoy kind of talking to each other, companies like that. They don't exist as a monolith. And you might say, well, if that's the case, Josh, if it's all just come down to how populous the country is and how large their marketing budgets are, well, then why not go for really large companies as well, like China or India, right? Like tapping into those countries, the two more populous countries in the world and vastly more populous than the United States. Surely they have the most money to spend on these kind of things. But that doesn't really track either. And one of the reasons is because the people in North America are very consumer pilled, and they're also fairly wealthy in a global sense, right? So if you're from the USA, you have more disposable income than a lot of people from a lot of places around the world, even if you're not a particularly rich person or even a middle class person in the USA. So the people who watch esports, or the people who watch television or whatever, tend to spend more per view from the USA, from North America in general, than they do compared to India or China or other really populous countries like Indonesia and Pakistan, etc. So advertisers pay more to get those viewers because the viewers spend more. So you have this kind of chain that connects like that. And that's one of the reasons why, in fact, I think that's the main reason why G2 really want to be involved in VCT Americas, because it's going to allow them access to US sponsors. They're going to get a lot more US viewers. And once you hit a certain threshold, let's say like 55, 60%, something like that, of US viewers on a product, you get access to much larger, juicier sponsorship packages from these US companies. Now, we went on a bit of a tangent there talking about marketing budgets and stuff, but to dial back in a second, we were talking about the fact that G2 are very likely to be paying these players well, basically, right? They said that they're targeting in this report at least 3 players, but we saw the tweets from 4 players saying that they were signed, and Tex tweeting as if he wasn't. But I want to make the point here again that following up from my previous videos where I was talking about the fact that a lot of these issues with teams not signing TPAs or being declined into VCT, Riot's really got their hands tied in a couple of these spots if they don't want to sell a spot, right? They've said over and over, we don't want to sell the spot. We're not selling VCT spots. Motherfucker, you just sold one. You just sold one. G2 just bought one. G2 just bought a spot by paying the players an enormous amount. You could argue more than their market worth, because their market worth is tied now to this spot. So their worth is not just based on what they're going to do for you in the game. Their worth is also that they kind of like carrying a VCT spot along with them, like they robbing a bank. So I'm just absolutely baffled, essentially, at Riot going on record over and over saying they don't want to sell a spot when they just have sold a spot. And to be clear, the guard players, if this is the restriction that you need to target at least 3 players, then this is going to happen every time there's a free agent team. There's just going to be a bidding war, and whoever offers them the most lucrative salaries or the ones that keep the most members of the team together or whatever, they're just going to take that. It puts all the power in the hands of the players, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Actually, I quite like this system. But it is selling a spot. And that means that kind of logic should not then be applied outwards as like, we don't want to sell a spot, therefore we shouldn't allow orgs to take buyouts for a slot. Why not? The players are getting paid. Why not allow an org to take buyouts for players if they still have them under contract? Remember that these guard players became free agents on September 1st. And that's one of the reasons why they were allowed to be treated as a free agent team. Let's move on, though, because I'm sick of fucking molding about this stuff. All right, so let's focus on the 3 thing just for a second. So 3 is obviously a magic number to avoid disputes. When you have 5 players on a team and you lock up 3 of them, it's not like the other 2 can claim that they're the real guard roster, right? If Trent and Tex had been left out of this acquisition by G2, they can't create a rival application for the slot. There's literally less players involved. So that's why the 3 out of 5 rule has always existed for Counter-Strike, and why it seems to be applied here to Valorant, although the only real... I mean, we don't have this from an official rulebook. We have this from a report of somebody talking to a source involved in either G2 or the Guard. So my questions would be, do they have to retain these players? And if so, for how long? Remember that this spot is going to be temporary. They have this, G2, assuming that this deal does go through, and it looks like it is. They have this spot for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, the TPA expires. Do they have to keep all 3 members of the Guard, or at least 3 members of the Guard, on the team the entire time for the 2 years? Do they have to at least have them signed at the beginning of the year and then they can make roster moves afterwards? Could they sign the Guard players for an extraordinary bag and then just let them all go and sign a budget team and just keep the slot anyway? I don't know. I don't know whether those kind of safeguards exist. Looking at the roster construction rules, which I did another video about, I don't think it's very likely that there's many safety clauses put in there for the players. I think just judging by the way that the roster construction rules are made, it doesn't seem very player focused. So I would doubt that G2 are forced to hold on to these Guard players for the entire duration. I think the general way that we're seeing the rules lean is power to the orgs, not power to the players. So it would seem more likely that they only have to have them maybe at the start of the season, maybe for the entire first year, something like that. There's no way of us really knowing unless there's another report put out. But I think it's an interesting question to have and an interesting thing to think about. Like, how do we want it to be structured? Like, how do we think it should be structured? Because as we can tell, as a community, we actually do have a little bit of input here because of, how the thing turned out with the guard previously not being treated as a free agent roster whatsoever. If you were only forced to keep 3 guard players, and let's say they just chose to keep Jonah P, Net, and Valen, right? Could they drop at some point Jonah P and Net and pick back up Trent and Tex in order to keep 3 players from the guard and keep the slot? Maybe. I think these are interesting questions, though, in terms of how the rules are constructed. And I just want to go, even though we've seen that there are these tweets from 4 of the players, Valen, Trent, Jonah P, and Net. Even though we've seen those, I just want to have a hypothetical here. If G2 was going to pick up only 3 guard players, which ones would it be? And I think a lot of you would think, well, obviously you want like the most important players. You want Trent, you want Valen, and then you probably want somebody else like maybe Jonah P. But I would assume counterintuitively that if G2 were only to pick up 3 players, which it doesn't look like they are, they would pick up the 3 G2 players. If G2 were to pick up 3 guard players, they would pick up the guard players with the lowest market value. And the reason for that being that the 2 players with the highest market value would be sought by other VCT teams in theory because they have more value. They are, better players. And that would drive up the price a little bit for G2, who only care about, in this hypothetical world, having 3 in order to just lock the spot up. And just having 3 mediocre, not even mediocre, right? Because all of the guard players are really good. But having the 3 worst players on the team, who are still not bad, is still super valuable to G2 because they would also inherit the spot. However, that's just a silly hypothetical. At least it seems like in the real world, it would be much more likely, surely, for all 5 players to get picked up because they look like they've been winning. Although the rumor is that Leaf is replacing Tex. So let's just take a little moment to talk about that. Rumors are flying around the Valorant scene at the moment. So by the time you even watch this, which I'm going to be releasing it almost as soon as I record it, but by the time you watch this, you may know that Tex has signed somewhere else, or you may know that Leaf is not joining G2 or whatever. The rumors are flying faster than anyone can possibly keep on top of them. Tactical Rab, though, is doing his absolute darn best to keep on top of it. As is Flynn as well. But the rumor currently is that Leaf is replacing Tex, and I thought that Tex worked extremely well in the guard system, especially under Josh RT, who he'd played with before, and Josh had crafted a system. You can go and listen to Valen talking to Wyatt about this on the Unnamed podcast. And Valen spoke about how Josh RT created a system with the guard when he came in and replaced MCE, where it worked well for Tex. It was much more about the mid-rounding and much less about having set plays and set executes. It put power into Valen's hands, and it allowed Tex the freedom to be able to work around the map. And it allowed Tex to reach new heights. He really has looked like a completely different player compared to what we saw from him. There were glimpses of him looking really good on his former teams, on NRG, for example. But he really came into his own under the guard. However, I am so unbelievably high on Leaf. He's been at one of the top of my lists for forever. I think I rated him one of the best players, or like anticipated him to be one of the best players of 2022, I think that was, where his team just absolutely bombed out because they made that Zeta Curry trade at the beginning of the year. But I was high on Leaf then. I was still high on Leaf at the end of the season. I was still high on Leaf in 2023 when he looked like probably top 2 in Americas alongside Aspas. And the more that I've heard about Leaf and what he does behind the scenes, the higher I seem to get on him. So I do think that this would be a ridiculous upgrade, even though Tex has been playing super well. If they can plug Leaf into the guards roster, that to me is a bonkers good team. And speaking specifically about this like system that Josh RT created where Tex was able to flourish, I don't think that Leaf is necessarily going to be better than Tex within that system, But I do think that there are more systems that Leaf can work well within. He's such a well-rounded player in terms of his agent pool. If you needed somebody else to pick up Duelist, like if you wanted Trent to play Raze, for example, I don't know why you necessarily would, because Leaf is also a really good Raze player, but if you wanted to do something funky like that, or if there was a zero Duelist meta that came up, Leaf would easily be able to fill in the Skye, the Viper, the whatever you wanted him to play. He's extraordinarily good. And he also brings a ton of ideas to the table. The other Cloud9 players from this year have talked about the fact that Leaf does a lot of prep work. He studies tons of different tape. And when he sees an opponent's comp, he knows the way he wants to play around it. That is super valuable to have. Someone decisive, someone that knows what they want up at the front of your team. And someone that can go toe-to-toe with the absolute best in the world when it comes to his fragging as well. Even if this was completely untrue, and even if Tex does end up signing to G2 and they just have the full guard roster, that team is still going to do really well. They were scrimming against the top teams. Other top teams in franchising, in the partnership system, I should say, this year, were taking things from the guard. The Viper walls that they were running and the setups that they were using, the pistol rounds that they were running as well. The partnership teams in Americas were talking about stealing things from the guard repeatedly from their scrims. The guard would have been able to hold their own. Hell, I think the guard would have won LCQ if they were allowed to participate and would have been able to make it to champions this year. And that's even without participating in the regular season. Who knows how well they would have done there. So overall, I think this resolution is excellent for both parties, frankly. I think G2 get where they want to be. And let's have one more conversation just shortly about G2. Because I think a lot of people are going to be speculating, right? If G2 are looking to get in and they got denied before, what's to say that Riot won't deny them again? Because the way that the system was set up is that the guard was supposed to agree with an org and then present the org to Riot. I don't think that that's a very good way of doing it. I think Riot should have pre-approved some organizations and then allowed the guard players to communicate with those organizations. However, that doesn't appear to be the way that it worked. I don't think that G2 are going to get denied this time around. It's a temporary slot. It is not a permanent partnership slot. And that makes a huge difference. On the first round of partnerships kind of applications, you need to be confident from Riot's point of view that you want to work with these organizations for as long as Valorant survives, right? You give them a TPA, it has essentially no expiry date, and you're working with them for the long term. You can't kick them out over something small. You've already committed to a long-lasting relationship. It would have to be something very major for you to decide to sever that. And there's probably things in the TPA that are very strict about what happens if they are severed. And it's probably not very good for Riot to have to go through that kind of system. So when you have a temporary slot that only lasts for 2 years, suddenly you can relax a lot of those guidelines. You don't have to be as stringent about who you work with, and you can afford to allow, G2 into the partnership system at the moment. And this is even, I think even if Carlos was still at the helm and he was having regular parties with Andrew Tate, they might still be allowed to participate. We don't know how relaxed the guidelines would be in terms of being accepted to sign the TPA. But I would imagine that for this, it's quite a loose line compared to where the permanent partnership slots were at. So anyway, yes, I think this is a good resolution for both parties. G2 get what they want in terms of being involved in Valorant at the top level and being in VCT Americas where they get access to better sponsorship opportunities. I think the guard players obviously have a much better resolution than being left out in the cold, and it's a better resolution because they get the bag. The guard, there's no way they were getting paid very much. They were, compared to the quality of that team, they were probably one of the most underpaid rosters in the world compared to the teams around them in Americas for sure. They probably weren't that underpaid compared to the EMEA and Pacific teams that they were equivalent to, but compared to the Americas teams, certainly. Tex is the only player who looks like he's potentially missing out. It might have been his choice. There's a lot of community speculation right now that he decided to not sign with G2 in order to go towards NRG, but I think people are just basing that off him talking to Chet and having those Discord logs leaked. But I would doubt that it was Tex's choice because he does seem to have a winning ticket with this former guard roster. He's never really won much before in Valorant. He's never looked as good as he did with this team. I don't know why you would want to throw that away for a different opportunity, especially when it looks like G2 are throwing the bag around to try and get the slot. So it doesn't really make sense that Tex would give it up himself rather than G2 wanting to replace him. But we'll see where he ends up. And I think that he's still a pretty good player that's probably going to land on his feet, as long as people don't just assume that the guard was carrying him to look better than he actually was. But I think if you watch the games, Tex really developed as a player towards especially the latter half of this year. And the other bonus at the end of all of this, which is unrelated to the G2 or guard situation, is that this now really nicely frees up John Cutie to go to Sentinels. Valen was previously reportedly rumored to be competing with John Cutie for that spot on Sentinels as the IGL, and Valen doesn't really fit. I mean, Valen's, in my opinion, probably a better IGL than John Cutie, but I don't think Valen fits on that squad when you have Pancada there, because then Pancada has to play Sentinel again. Ugh. Whereas John Cutie's an excellent match for Sentinels. They brought in Def at the beginning of the year to be John Cutie, to be a Sentinel main who could IGL for the team, not be the heaviest fragger by any means, but provide some kind of structure that's going to allow the others to achieve their heights. And that is what they'll be hoping for with John Cutie if that move does end up going through. And it frees up Pancada to go back to Smokes. It just works perfectly with the rest of their roster. I'll probably do another video on that Sentinels team specifically, though, because I want to dive into TenZ as a duelist and talk about what I think he can improve on. Because I've been quite vocal in the terms of me not enjoying watching his duelist play, but I think a lot of people don't quite understand why I don't like his duelist play, so I think I need to provide some evidence, don't I? Otherwise, it's basically angry old man shouts at cloud. So that's it in terms of the Garden G2 situation. Again, a reminder, if you're not subscribed to this channel, just have a quick scroll down and see whether you are. I've started a new Valorant channel, and it's going to be having videos like this. And like I said, some VOD review videos. I'm planning on doing a TenZ one. And now that I've said it, I guess I've got to do it. So let's start watching some TenZ VODs. Thanks for the sub if you did. If you didn't, well, fuck you. All good. Then I'll see you next time.